daily news. The daily news. So we're proud that you chose us to come and do your work. Ginger is the author of Firefight. There is some very, very pertinent information centered around this book and this presentation. And so we're just happy that you thought it not robbery to put this information together, because there's so much I know I didn't know about firefighters, and so she's put it in the manner of a textbook, which is here for us forever. So we're grateful for your effort, and we give praise and honor to the Most High who's allowed you to put this together. Amen. So with Ginger is going to come in her own way and tell us all about her and why she wrote this book. And so we'd like to welcome her and give her the love that we know how to give. Welcome, Ginger.
Hooray!
Oh, well, thank you. That was a very lovely, lovely greeting. I appreciate it very much. And thank you to Jennifer for allowing me to come and talk about Firefight. It's actually really wonderful to have a bookstore that still hosts authors and lets them come and talk. It's getting rarer and rarer and rarer. And particularly I'm happy to be here in Harlem because for a couple of reasons. A, I wrote the book just not too far away in my house. And B, Wesley Williams, who was one of the very first black firefighters in New York City, really started his battle here in Harlem, and it was at the Harlem Y, which was then the Colored Y, on 125th Street in Lenox. And although he was born in Harlem and he grew up in the Bronx, but a lot of his life was lived here in Harlem. And when he started his fight with the fire department over integration, he had to rely on the Harlem community, which was then the Black Power base, and Adam Clayton Powell and the Inez Dickens father, and many people like that were involved in this whole struggle. So it's wonderful to be in the environment that started it all. One lady here had asked about the cover of the book. Who's the cover of the book? I actually didn't know this when the publisher came to me and told me that that was going to be the cover, but I was very happy to have it as the cover because it's very arresting, a beautiful face. But it's this man, I found out, Adam Long. And he is a fire chief now in St. Louis City. And when he was a young firefighter just starting out, he made this save, he saved this baby, and somebody caught this picture from the St. Louis Dispatch. This was in the 80s, and it won a Pulitzer. It went all around the world. So this was actually part of a photo shoot that he did in the 1980s that was for People magazine. And 20 years later, someone at Macmillan saw it and liked it and put it on the book cover. And I know all of this because when he saw it, he contacted me and said, hey, guess what? That's me. What I found out from him, I was able to meet him this summer in St. Louis. He is the only black fire chief in St. Louis City. And when he retires, there will be none. And that's in St. Louis, which is a fairly diverse city. So the topics that I'm talking about in here and that we encountered in New York City are not limited to this particular area. This is something that has gone on in a lot of different places, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest cities, wherever there was a large immigrant population around the time of the Great Migration. And there's various reasons for all of that, but what we know from this history here in New York City is that what happened 100 years ago with some of the pioneers who were coming in, like Wesley Williams, who was hired in January 10th, 1919, these same problems almost continue today. So in New York City, you have the largest fire department in the country, and it's the second largest in the world, second only to Tokyo. There's almost 11,000 firefighters. How many of them today do you think are black or African American? Just a guess.
5%.
Anyone?
5%.
5% is close. They're getting there. They're working on it. For almost the entire 150-year history of the official fire department, which started, this is its 150th year anniversary today, it started in 1865, or this year, there has never been more than 650 blacks on the department. And there were only 650 blacks for a span of about 15 years in the late 70s, when the organization of black firefighters, known as the Vulcan Society, made its first forays into the courts. And they succeeded in getting a judge imposed basically a hiring quota For every 3 firefighters hired, 3 white firefighters hired, one had to be black or Latino. That court order was in place for 4 years, I think it was, and as soon as it ended, the city dropped that system. And the number went phew. So for almost the entirety of its history, it's basically had about 300 blacks on the job at any given time. And that's in a city of, yes, I'm sorry. Women. So that's a whole other kettle of fish. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thought. So the lady said that when did women start coming on, and she, like many people, doesn't think that women are qualified. It's a tough job. It's a tough job. And you know, someone else said that once at our discussion, and Regina Wilson, who is a firefighter, a woman firefighter, she's currently the president of the Vulcan Society, the first woman to be the president of the Vulcan Society, and she's the 12th African-American female or woman to come into the fire department. She had a great answer, and that was basically that she has to go through the exact same training as every man. And she is, the training that they give the men, when the men finish that training, the fire department says, you are qualified to be a firefighter. And she does the exact same thing that they do, and she has the same exact qualifications. And if you have a problem in a fire, believe me, you're not going to be checking who's coming to get me. You're just going to be glad that somebody's there. That's right. And Regina would get you out. There is no doubt. Now, I also add on to that myself some information about firefighting, because I find that there's a great deal of mythology around particularly the fire department here in New York City, because A, we love it, B, they do a great job, C, 9/11, you know, just stirred up a lot of emotion around it, so it's hard to not think of them as above average in every way. But we do have a little bit of a myth. I call it the myth of the almighty male firefighter, right? And we have this fantasy, very Hollywood, that something happens in a fire, they're going to come in and scoop us out and take us out, and they're not even going to break a sweat. They can do it all. The reality is that a lot of firefighters, the number one cause of death of line of duty for firefighters is a heart attack, right? Because it's a tremendous tax on the system. Cardiovascular fitness is what keeps them alive, and it helps them keep you alive. It's not the brute strength, because when you talk about actual firefighting, not the Hollywood stuff, they're in 100 pounds of gear, right? It doesn't allow them to get any air. It's bunker gear. It's fire retardant. So they're sweating incredibly, but they can't, you know, they're not getting any, there's nothing breathes through that. They're in a fire with intense heat, and they're probably, if they're looking for you in a smoke condition, they're on their hands and knees with their hands out, looking through an apartment, trying not to snag their equipment on a place where they can't see, and so they work in teams, because that's the safest thing for them. And men, when they work in teams, they're fully aware that, you know, the guy who comes in who's 5'8" and 160 pounds doesn't have the same probably strength ratio as the other guy who's 6'2" and 230 pounds. And they just work together. You know, they just work as a team. And when women are allowed to work as a team and have their strengths admitted without it being a weakness that they're stronger at this and less strong at that, they contribute just as much. And generally speaking, women use less oxygen per tank and have a higher level of cardiovascular systems, or a more efficient cardiovascular system. So in many cases, women physically are just as fit, if not more fit than men for this job. How few numbers they had in the fire department. And I thought, how can that be? It's such a big department, and the hiring system is so fair, right? That's what I thought at the time. It's civil service. You take a test, you get a score, and they rank it based on your score. The test is not, does not have an inherent bias, right? It's not like the SAT scores where they used to give you questions that would be like, what's the length of a football field times 4? Well, if you didn't know what a football field length was, how could you answer that question, right? So questions like that with inherent bias that had already been cleared off the test. So I didn't really grasp what's the problem. There are some black firefighters who get on, just not a lot. And it took me a little while to get some education on the topic, but here's the number one thing I realized that's really relevant. Does anybody have a guess on what your average starting firefighter makes on this job?
About
65.
About 30, 40.
$100,000.
What?
Yeah, now that's, they come in, you want it for your nephew, right? You want it for your cousin. Now, you may not be thinking, I don't want black people to have this job. That, that may not be in your head. For many people, I think that's not in their head. They're just trying to look out for their own, as people do. Right? But the problem is that when this system was designed, black people were not a factor. They were not allowed to be a factor. And so this system has come forward over 100 years. And even though we like to say, oh, well, the test that is given, the entrance exam that is written and given is colorblind and prejudice-free, it's extremely hard for a rational person to accept that. When you look at 150 years, and the fire department is the only uniformed agency in the city that has never increased, hasn't changed, hasn't increased the number of black people on the job. If you look at the Department of Corrections, which has an entrance exam, it's 60% people of color, right? Why is that? The fire department's own EMS services that operate within the fire department, very, very diverse, with women as well. So what is it about this particular agency and this issue? And the thing is that I think of it as it's like global warming. It's not one thing, it's many things. With the fire department, there are hiring cycles every 4 years. And so when you go through this, roughly every 4 years, so when you go through these 4 years, you take the exam, anywhere from 20 to 30,000 people generally take these exams, because now we know why, right? They want this job. And how many people in that time frame do you think the fire department is likely to hire?
Not that many.
2,000 to 3,000, right? Over a 4 or 5 year period. So you're talking, your chances of actually getting a job are very, very slim. Very slim. Yes.
Are you saying also that the suburban, like cops, those areas, they make the same salary as New York City firemen?
Oh, actually, many times in the suburbs, they make more. I know with the cops, the police, the Nassau County Police actually make a higher salary than the NYPD. I think the fire department, our firefighters tend to be among the highest paid. But they're pretty good jobs overall. The uniformed civil service jobs are the highest paid. And it's also, we have to look at that in a larger sense. When we talk about civil service, there's a tremendous sense of that civil service as something that has helped the black community. And it has, right? The gateway to the middle class. So actually, during the 2007 economic downturn, the New York Times had a whole article about how the cut to the civil service, the sequester, was hurting black families the hardest. And that is accurate. When you're talking about the post office, you're talking about federal jobs that are kind of bureaucratic, middle management. But when you go to the uniformed civil service, police departments and fire departments, that same reality does not hold true. And those are the higher paid in general jobs. That's how you get, say, a Ferguson. We have a predominantly white police department policing a majority black community. So there has been, over the history of America, a long kind of slide into hegemony within these things, and there's some argument of whether it's deliberate or not deliberate, but what the Vulcans said was it really doesn't matter. Who cares? The bottom line is these are really good jobs, and we're not able to get our foot in. And if they were, unfortunately they're not here, they would be able to give you their own description of this, which is quite fascinating, but they had to wage basically a ground war. And it started with Wesley Williams in 1919. Now I have Vivian Nicholson here, whose great-grandfather is actually the very first black firefighter in New York City, and his name was William H. Nicholson, and he came in 1898. And what we know about him, Vivian actually wrote a first person for me that's going to be in the Daily News, the New York Daily News tomorrow, but we know a little bit about him. And he grew up, well, we don't know if he grew up, I think he came from Virginia, right? But he settled in Brooklyn, right? And he got on the job because at that time, Brooklyn was its own fire department. And Brooklyn also had a much more robust black community. And the fire commissioner over there, if I'm remembering correctly, his name was Adamson, but his first name was Robert Lee. And He did. He brought, he was actually a very progressive man, I've learned. He was the first one to appoint a woman in the fire corps to do some work, not to be a firefighter, but to do some work. She was an inspector.
Putting our struggle out, and all of that creates pressure that made the fire department change. Yeah, so you know, a lot of black churches got politicians involved. We had a ton of politicians involved in the fight. So it really was a grassroots effort from the bottom up.
In terms, I know the racial politics in these countries are sort of complicated, but in terms of the Latino firefighters, what was your sense of, you know, first, were their numbers, have their numbers been super low in the department historically, and what's your sense of why they didn't want to consolidate the
Well, yeah, their numbers have been low. Their numbers were lower than ours always until about maybe 15 years ago when they caught up and then they passed our numbers. But I mean, right, they passed, when we were at 300, they were at maybe 500 or so. And I want to make it clear that we had a lawsuit in the early 70s, in 1973, that was a joint venture between the Vulcans and the Hispanic Society. A lot of it, when our turn, we brought our lawsuit and started all our media action and so on. I personally went to the president of Hispanics, a guy named Miguel Ramos, and a lot of it was on him. It was really, as the leader of the organization, he kind of decided, nah, I don't want anything to do with it. And it was just really, you know, there's a lot of pressure in the firehouse when you come out and you do this kind of stuff. You know, you're not welcome in the firehouses and you're kind of shunned and pushed aside, and they didn't want any of that, you know. And they, you know, and that's, when I say they, really it was him more than anybody else. But he, you know, he's the head of an organization. He probably feels that's what the organization wants. But a lot of it was on him. There's a guy named Jose Garcia, who was the previous president of Miguel. He was a real militant guy. You know, he had been in charge. He would have been different.
And I won't bore you all with all of it now, and it's not boring, I promise, because I tried really hard to make it exciting. But Firefight, I was able to go through all of the documents and pull out how many times since the 80s, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services and the Fire Department and the Mayor's Office, through various mayoral regimes, was told, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. Even some of their own watchdog agencies within the city administration was they were writing memos and saying, you're going to have a problem. And there was simply no institutional will within the city, within various administrations, to challenge this, because it was an unpopular thing to challenge. The myth is that the civil service system is a fair, above reproach system, and there is, you know, is anyone who takes the test gets the same fair shot. And, you know, the Vulcans never ever argued that the test is too difficult for us to pass, or that the city has to dumb down this exam so that we can get on in equal numbers. They never said that. They just said, if you're going to give an exam, and it does have a disparate impact on us, not because it's actually discriminatory questions in it, but just purely because it's a standardized test, and everyone knows at this point, for a variety of reasons right now, when you give a standardized test, in general, whites will score at the top, blacks in the middle, Latinos underneath that. There are exceptions, but those are the general bands. That doesn't mean the test itself is discriminatory. But since the city was giving basically awarding these jobs through a system that automatically put blacks in general a little bit behind, you have to make sure that you're actually testing for something that matters. And what it comes down to, when you take this exam, if you don't get anything above a 95, you're not going to get this job. You're not going to have a shot because of the competition. So you had generations and generations of not just black firefighters, but all kinds of firefighters who might have been really, really good at that job. They might have had the physicality, they might have had the temperament, they might have had the courage to be exceptional. But, you know, because they got an 89 and somebody else got a 92, they didn't get a shot. That's what the Vulcans challenged. And Paul won't say this because it wasn't his goal. He, unabashedly, he was about getting more blacks on the fire department. The biggest benefactor of that lawsuit is white firefighters, white male firefighters, because they're the biggest group that comes out to take this test by far. And so many of them never got a shot at this job because Why? Because of a random exam that determined nothing about how qualified they were for the job.
It's not nearly, there's some danger to the job, you know, but, you know, it's not as dangerous as people perceive it.
Is it always necessary though when you're going into a said house for you to start tearing up things? And part of that is that because I'm from New Jersey, I was raised here, and we had a group of black firemen, and we had a fire at my house, it was electrical fire, and when they got through the kitchen was in like nothing was torn up. You know, and I said, I thought just because I had those brothers on that force. But is it true? Is it necessary?
Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's up to, you know, sometimes you're right. It's because they don't care sometimes about the people that they're serving, you know, and they don't care about wrecking this house, or sometimes it's the person, and it shouldn't be up to the person, but if the person makes it clear, hey, you know, don't tear my place up, and, you know, raise your health, that helps as well. But, you know, I can honestly say most times, you know, a lot of times if you go into your house and it seems like you did a whole lot of damage, a lot of times you have to. You know, a lot of times you have to. You have to remember when we're in there doing our damage, we can't see anything. You know, it's completely black. There's a fire somewhere in there. You know, it's not like. And then when you come in and it's smoke.
So by the time I came along, by the time all of this wrapped up in like 2011, I said, well, listen, you know, I think this would make a really great book, because I was fascinated by that. And I said to them, and I had always imagined that must have been incredible tense meetings, you know, in City Hall between the Vulcans and Mayor Bloomberg, and the Vulcans would never tell me, because I wouldn't play chess with Paul or poker for that matter, because, you know, they're very astute. They waged a really good campaign. And I, from the very beginning, kind of looked at them and said, I think Bloomberg might be underestimated a little bit. And I think he did. I think that played a role in this. And all of City Hall, I think it did. But when all of this wrapped up, I went to the Vulcans and I said, okay, now you can tell me everything. And they said, yeah, you know everything. That's it. Bloomberg never, beyond the 2 meetings that we know of that are in Firefight that are seen, never had a big thing, never had discussion, never sat down to talk. And in a way, that turned out to help me as the writer, because I went looking for more information. And that's when I found out the backstory to the Vulcans. Because like all people, you know, you think the story starts when you find it, right? But there was a...
Columbus was Captain.
Right. I was columbizing the Vulcans' history. And when I found, you know, Wesley Williams, and I started digging into the very first black firefighters that were coming along, that was just tremendous stuff to read and discover, and to know that Wesley Williams, his speeches and his words were at the Schomburg Center, that was there to delve into. And a Vulcan Society member who recently passed away, John Ruffins, who died in February, lovely man, he had the foresight, he was what, 92 I think, when he died. He had the foresight to sit down with Wesley Williams in 1976 and record an interview with him, and he kept it. And so there's an excerpt that Michael has that he can hand out to all of you of Firefight, just a little take-home that you can share with other people. And there's actual dialogue in that from Wesley Williams' very first day in his engine house, in Engine 55 in Little Italy, which is still there. And I got all of those words and I got all of that dialogue because John Ruffins recorded Wesley Williams telling these stories. And he kept it on an 8-track cassette, which I was able to get the sound off of, thankfully. So when I started to meld these stories together, that's when I decided, you know, and it was a hard book to get sold. It was a hard book to get published. You know, it's one of those stories that I think if I just told Wesley Williams and the stories of the earlier black firefighters, maybe it would have been a more commercial success. You know, America is okay now with celebrating black history and black heroes. It's a long time ago, but to kind of celebrate Paul and Michael and all the Vulcans and the work they did, that is a harder sell.
Was also challenged, and it was supposed to be an intelligence test, a cognitive skills test. But in reality, what it is how you have been trained, 1, to take those tests, and 2, about the how you've been, I'll just leave it at that, how you've been trained to take those tests. It does not test your cognitive abilities, and I have issues with the use of cognitive, because cognitive is highly valued in American culture. So to use a term that we all, black, white, Asian, whatever, highly value, and to say that, you know, blacks can't take this test or don't do well on it because it's cognitive, it's testing your cognitive abilities. I do have issues with it. It reminds me a lot of, remember the, I didn't know
I
how.
have no idea.
It
I mean,
was.
probably nothing to do with anything that mattered to a firefighter, and I don't know how much it tested anything
I think
cognitively either.
using the lexicon of the people who are like oppressing is also something that we're in the process of looking at and learning how to reframe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know actually what it was testing for.
Yeah.
That's just how it was labeled.
Well,
That's
I
a good
love
point.
that you did that because I'm sure you weren't very popular either.
I don't think so. No. Probably not.
And this is going to be a crazy question, but I'm sitting here and I'm wondering, how many of the, have they found any of the firefighters, I'm not talking about just blacks, being alcoholics, doing
Oh.
a job? That's a scary thing, you know? And I've been sitting here thinking about it, so let me ask you.
The fire department had a problem with alcohol abuse for a long time, you know, and some drastic steps were taken to curb it. And it's you know, I'd say now it's certainly well under control. But over the years, yeah, there was you know, a history in the fire department of a lot of alcohol abuse. But now it's, you know,
how this data informed what we've done it. We're so happy that we've done it. I'm recommending that our book club puts this on our list.
Yay.
So we
Yay!
want you to come
Yeah.
read it so we can talk more.
Yes.
But we're just so happy. And what you run in a very, very important circle, I just want to introduce this one. Mr. Hack. Who listens to WBAI?
Yay!
That person that we'll be listening to, one of them. And so we're happy that he took time out of his busy schedule to come also. So thank you so much. He ordered a book, so I think it'll be coming back.
Yeah.
You, brother, thank you so much.
For your
We're so
service.
proud of you. We love you. We are elated for the kind of work that you do for us. Thank you so much.
Yes, your service.
More importantly, it's also about the fact that the fire department, for many years, there were so many generations of women and Latinos and blacks, people of color, who thought that they were not welcome there. And they didn't even try for these jobs in a lot of cases. Or they did try and they had a bad experience and they got turned away. And it's not going to be like that anymore because of the work of the Vulcan Society, started by Wesley Williams in 1919, but continued today. And we are really trying to actively push that message out because the fire department is supposed to start another round of hiring in the spring, in the coming spring. And the more people of color who turn out, the better their chances are of getting on this job. The test is different now. A lot of the hiring process is different. The Vulcans are there to help them walk through the whole thing. Paul, one of the things I did in this book was, for Firefight, I would go out to Brooklyn, and again, Paul, he's got his own family, he's got a full-time job, and he would be out there every Saturday doing physical training with candidates of color to help get them in shape ahead of the test. So not only did he single-handedly increase the white readership of the New York Amsterdam News, he helped get so many people onto this job. Black, white, women, all of them. So.
Yay!
I got 4.
Pam or Pam? You, Lorraine, Sisters Uptown. Nice. So thank you, Mark.
She got a hold of it. She got a hold of it. Okay. Try again.